Okay, so chapter 4 deals with understanding and explaining culture. So we've looked at kind of describing culture. Chapter 4 deals with kind of the methods involved and kind of some of the theoretical aspects, theoretical orientations. So here are some of the things that we'll cover in chapter 4. And so in chapter 1 we talked about the anthropological curiosity, and in cultural anthropology we're looking to explain culture. It's the shared learned beliefs that we have, and explain. An explanation is basically an answer to a why question. So why does this particular culture do this particular thing and not this one? Is it some kind of environmental explanation or whatever it might be? It's an answer to a why question. And so some of this stuff from chapter 4 you're going to have had in other classes, such as an association or relationship. So you've got two particular variables that may be related in some kind of predictable way. So you might think of a scatter plot where you've got one variable on this side and one on this side, and you can usually, or if there's some kind of an association, I should say, you can draw a trend line through it and that sort of thing. And so that is, although cultural anthropology tends to be more subjective and descriptive, you can get these kind of numerical or quantitative data and associations and that sort of thing. So one example, so you've got the variables of water and temperature. So the statement that water becomes ice at 32 degrees Fahrenheit defines an association between those two variables of water and temperature. And so a theory then will explain why an association exists. So theories explain why laws or associations exist. Scientists try to formulate theories that will explain observed relationships. But theories can never be proved with absolute certainty. And in fact, if you've looked at if you study kind of the history of science, or just within a particular discipline, theories come and go. But at the particular time that they exist, the group of scientists within that particular discipline hold it to be true, but it can never be proved with absolute certainty. It can only be falsified. So the method of falsification, which shows that a theory seems to be wrong, is the main way that theories are judged. But until this falsification occurs, most generally theories are accepted. So we're going to kind of give a brief overview of theoretical approaches that have occurred within anthropology, and kind of look at the advantages and disadvantages of these particular theoretical orientations that we'll discuss, and also just general advantages and disadvantages of theoretical orientations in general. So a theoretical orientation is basically a paradigm. It's a way of thinking. It kind of guides your research. And it's always important to know when you're looking at a particular person's research what kind of theoretical orientation they're operating under. So to kind of look at this from a historical perspective in cultural anthropology, some of the first theories or theoretical orientations to come about was what we now refer to as early evolutionism. And so it's basically applying Darwin's ideas of natural selection to cultures, and how they looked at these particular Edward Tyler and Lewis Henry Morgan looked at how cultures evolve over time, and they kind of compared it to a biological organism, so that there were certain stages of evolution in a culture. So culture might start out in kind of a simple savage type stage, and then they move to barbarians, and then they move to civilized culture. And if you remember the term ethnocentrism from chapter 2, which you should because it's an important term, it's those categories themselves are judgmental, and the thought that cultures evolve in a linear, uniform manner is not accepted today. So this is an early theoretical approach within anthropology that's not very popular today. And the whole idea is that cultures evolve in a steady, uniform, linear manner over time. And so two names associated with that, sort of I like to call this the Jeopardy of cultural anthropology. So, when you're watching Jeopardy and Alex says the category is cultural anthropologists, and you can say, who is Lewis Henry Morgan, when they say, when the answer deals with early evolutionism. Also, not supported today, but was popular in early anthropology, is the race theory. Now, you'll see in this book, in the textbook, that they put race in quotes because we'll see in chapter 8 that race is a social construct and there's no biological aspect to it, although a lot of times the society that constructed the racial categories used biological criteria for being in a certain race, but it's completely arbitrary and made up, but consequential. So that's another phrase you might hear me say a lot on these videos, is arbitrary but consequential. So society tends to come up with these ideas, concepts, categories that are generally arbitrary, but whether or not you're in that category has huge consequences within that society sometimes. So the race theory is largely unsupported today, and it's kind of this idea that certain races are more intellectually superior and that sort of thing, which is flat out racist. It's obviously not popular anymore. But in early anthropology, is kind of strange that early anthropological thinking was kind of racist, and not kind of, it was, and that the ideas were that certain races were superior over others for whatever reasons. We now know that to be totally false, so that's gone through the falsification process. And then came along a guy named Franz Boas, and he was completely opposed to this race idea, completely opposed to the early evolutionism idea, and his focus was on, he considered these people like Tyler and Morgan to be armchair anthropologists who just sit around and come up with these theories from reading books and having pipes, and he said maybe we should go out and actually acquire some data and actually look at what's happening and come up with theories that way. And so his focus was on describing cultural variation and actually going out in the field and creating ethnographies and that sort of thing. Some other overview, through the overview of theoretical approaches, we've got the ecological approach, and again, your Jeopardy answer here, or question, Leslie White and Julian Stewart are were both proponents of this ecological approach, which focuses on adaptation. You may or may not have heard of environmental determinism before, but kind of looking at the environment, adapting to the environment, and how culture plays a role in that adaptation. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a theoretical orientation? One is it kind of guides helps guide your research. So one that we didn't discuss here would be a feminist approach. So that would be a theoretical orientation. So a feminist might look at why women play a subordinate role in certain cultures, or how does it differ across cultures, that sort of thing. So that its advantage is that it guides your research, but the disadvantages is it may or may not pick up on everything, and it kind of might focus you in a way that causes you to miss some of the big pictures. So when we're testing explanations, we need to follow certain methods, and you probably have covered some of these before in other courses, but easy for me to say, right? Operationalization and measurement. So how are we going to what are our operational definitions of particular aspects that we're studying? How are we going to measure these aspects, what kind of sampling technique are we going to use, and statistics and that sort of thing. So here on the left we've got the Yanomamo Indians of Brazil that depend on plantains, and you can see they're processing the plantains there, and also kielbasa roots, and they typically have a low protein diet. The Inuit, commonly called Eskimos, but prefer the term Inuit, depend largely on sea mammals and fish and have a relatively high protein diet. So if we think about the ecological approach, there is some, just based on the ecology, the environment that the culture is in itself, is going to have an impact for sure on food getting strategy, but also other aspects of the culture. So when we're looking at operationalization and measurement, we want to make sure that our research is done accurately, and so we need to kind of come up with these operational definitions of each concept and variable in our particular study. If you remember back in chapter 2, I mentioned how the concept of culture isn't always agreed upon. So for a particular study, you should tell at the beginning, this is my operational definitions. This is how I see culture, in all the other aspects that you're working as, and this is how my variables are going to be measured. Sampling techniques you probably came across before, and it holds true for cultural anthropology too. So researchers must specify the sampling universe, so the possible list of cases to be sampled from. So basically your population is this particular group of people. And random sampling is not often employed in anthropology just because it's we're dealing with humans here, and it's so if you randomly select humans, you're going to run into individual variation or individual availability, those sorts of things. Plus, when you're an ethnographer, so you're going to live with a particular group of people, you're going, just based on your own, maybe just even sex, like say as a man, I'm going into a particular culture, I'm only going to have access to certain segments of that population based on my sex alone. So as a man, I may not be able to go in and study, female reproduction ideas or something, something like that. So first of all, random sampling is not employed that often because of that. Also, a lot of times that's just what it is access to the individual. So statistical evaluation, you've had a lot of this before, I'm sure, but when running statistics, you get a p-value at the end, which tells you the probability that an observed result could have happened by chance. So if your p-value is less than 0.05, that means that if you did your statistics correctly, there is some sort of an association there, and it is statistically significant. So that means it's not likely that it occurred by chance. So to get to the methods within cultural anthropology, so some of these things like statistics and sampling and those sorts of things you deal with in other academic disciplines, but some of the unique types of research to cultural anthropology are things like ethnography, which we've discussed before. So it was only through anthropology that we've come up with this process of ethnography, where an ethnographer goes out, lives with a group of people for a certain amount of time, studies them, writes down what they learned, that sort of thing. So that's one. Within culture comparisons, so looking at some of the different segments of a culture, how those are related, how they're different. Regional controlled comparisons, so maybe looking at a particular region of the earth, some of the cultures that are involved in that particular region, how they are the same or different. And then cross-cultural research, where we look at all cultures of the world, and that's where we can come up with some of these universals that I've discussed, things that, what is it that all that we find in all cultures. So that's pretty interesting. And then just historical research, like your ethnohistorians, looking at a group of people over time. So again, ethnography is where the cultural anthropologist goes out and does field work, and then prepares what's called an ethnography, which is typically a book, but could also be a journal article or a movie or something like that, which describes and analyzes a single society. Historically, ethnographies were this thick. So if you look at Malinowski's Argonauts of the Western Pacific, this thing is going to be about this thick, and it's going to have a chapter on religion, a chapter on political economy, that sort of thing. Whereas today, I think ethnographers are there to focus more on one particular aspect of that particular culture. And when they do that, just like in any other discipline, there's ethical obligations that are involved in anthropology, particularly in anthropology because we're dealing with humans. So one obligation is to the people that they're studying. You don't want to, if these people are going to help you learn more about their culture, you don't really, you want to have a strong ethical concern for their well-being and for what is presented and that sort of thing, how it's presented. But there's also an ethical obligation to other anthropologists or your colleagues to explain how you did it, show that you did it in a way that's as objective as possible and that sort of thing. And then to the public and the world community, so you just want to be adding to our scientific knowledge, adding to our understanding of humans. And in some cases, you might be employed by a certain organization to do some anthropological research, and there's an ethical obligation to your employer, but then there's also these other ethical obligations that go into it. So the most important is to the people that you're studying. You want to be honest about what you found, objective. So honest and objective reporting is an obligation. So within culture comparisons is testing a theory within one society, comparing individuals, families, households, communities, or districts, for example, to see how the similarities and differences within one society. Regional controlled comparisons is an ethnographic comparison between societies in the same or similar region. And cross-cultural research is worldwide comparisons between societies having and those lacking a particular characteristic. So do all societies do this particular thing, or do they not? How do they vary? This method is beneficial in that the conclusion drawn is probably applicable to most societies. So cross-cultural comparison allows us to get at those universals, those things that all humans do. And then historical research, as I mentioned, ethnohistory consists of studies based on descriptive materials about a single society at more than one point in time. So you're looking at a group over time, and you're looking at the written accounts or descriptions of that particular group. So here would be an example of ethnohistorians gathering information from a variety of sources like travel journals. And again, some of these accounts may be biased, and that's something that they would have to take into account too. So for like in this case, when you've got European, so the Europeans could write and describe the cultures that they were coming across during colonial expansion, but a lot of times their accounts may be biased and that sort of thing. So that's something an ethnohistorian would have to take into account. So those are some of the quick methods used in anthropology, and also some of the theories and theoretical orientations that have existed within cultural anthropology. If you have any questions, feel free to email.